Good afternoon and welcome to Eton Bridge Partners' first webinar of 2022, Shaping the RemCo Strategy. It's great to see so many familiar faces from our network and welcome to those new to our network. My name's Louise Chaplin. I head up the board practice at Eton Bridge Partners. And before we focus on the topic of today, I would like to give you a brief update on the Eton Bridge activity, along with some insights from the market. So from a practical perspective and recruitment side, 2021 ended very strongly for the business, with activity across the breadth of corporate leadership, both on interim and permanent recruitment. Organisationally, we've very much grown in line with market demands and made a number of significant hires throughout 21 and early 22, and the business now stands at 93 employees. Private equity continues to be a key area of focus for us, with significant activity across both funds and portfolio companies. And this is not just focused in the UK, but very much looking at our European clients as well. And our international footprint continues to grow, and we are building a strong track record both in the Middle East, particularly in the UAE, and also in Southeast Asia. And we're certainly seeing that post-pandemic, there's been a number of C-suite hires being required, and this has been due to earlier on in the pandemic, a lot of expats returned to their sort of homeland, predominantly Europe or the US, and now that demand has been seen. And we've also seen quite a significant activity rise in Singapore, which I think is part due to the dominance of Hong Kong and being a centre of commerce, declining over the recent years. Interwoven this and our international offering, we are also now supporting clients from a consulting perspective with our Eton Bridge consulting brand. And we act very much as an independent strategic partner to help deliver large scale and complex transformations. And we're notably working with one global organisation in a global ERP transformation, working country by country to support them. Early this year, we've seen a great uptick in new roles, unsurprisingly in January, with organisations very much redefining or confirming their strategy, assessing their structure, and also then obviously assessing their teams and succession to ensure they had capability both within the boardroom and with the leadership team. So I hope that gives you a brief overview of where we are at the moment. Before we move on to the discussion, I'd be keen to introduce our panellists, and starting off, if I may, introduce Tia Koliani. Tia, please could you give us an overview of your current portfolio?
Hi there, and thank you for inviting me. So yes, I'm Tia Koliani. I am the Senior Independent Director and the Chair of the Remuneration Committee at Watches of Switzerland PLC. I am also the chair of RemCo at DWF Group PLC, which is a professional legal services organization, and I sit as a non-executive director without the RemCo chair responsibility on the board of ST Works, which is the second largest payroll provider in Europe, human capital business, but payroll at the core of what we do.
Thank you, Tia. Boris, it'd be great to hear about your current activity.
Thank you, Louise, and good afternoon. Thank you for inviting me. I am a non-executive director of Digital PLC and the chair of the RemCo for the past 3 years. Digital is a data-driven market automation platforms, and they are one of the little British champion on the IAM and expanding rapidly internationally. And I've got also a full-time employment where I work for GBG PLC, where I lead the EMEA operation, and delighted to join the discussion and try to share the perspective from an executive and non-executive position. Thank you.
Thank you, Boris. And finally, but no means least, last, Louis. Welcome and great to be working with you again on this webinar.
Louise, thank you. Very good to be part of the webinar. My name is Louis Cooper. I'm CEO of the Non-Executive Directors Association. I've got an accounting background. I've been through the big four accounting firms in various guises. And my areas of specialism are very much around governance, risk and assurance. I sit on the QCA Corporate Governance Expert Group, and we publish a QCA Remuneration Committee guide, and are keen to look at how remuneration committees work and support remuneration committees. NEDA is a members association. I'm one of the co-founders. We are very much in operation to support NEDs from cradle to grave, and very much focus on training and education, advisory and support, knowledge and networking, coaching and mentoring. We don't do recruitment, and that's where we very much work with Louise and the team at Eton Bridge. And also from our own background on these matters that we're covering today, we do run some training and education around ESG. We ran a session last week looking at risk and opportunities. And 3 times a year, we run a RemCo training course with Mercer and QCA, which we've been running now since 2015, looking at the issues faced by remuneration committees in particular. So that's me.
Thank you, Louis. We're here today to discuss shaping the RemCo strategy, and really importantly, will COVID and ESG really change the shape of that reward discussion? I think we felt in order to frame that discussion, and firstly, look, thank you very much for completing the questions on registering before you joined us. We will be discussing those later. But what I'd like to do is just to go back to Louis, if I may, so he can set the scene on remuneration policy review and the emerging trends in disclosure. Louis, I'll pass over to you, please.
Thank you, Louise. I've got a few things to share, but I think just sort of touching on the basics of what we're looking at, I think going back to sort of principles of looking at remuneration, I think remuneration policies and practices should be designed to support strategy and promote the long-term sustainable success of the organisation. I think these are important things to bear in mind in terms of setting your policy. And I think the key thing from a remuneration committee perspective is to focus on 6 main areas around clarity, simplicity, understanding the risks involved, both reputational and behavioural, predictability, so making sure the range of rewards are identified and explained, proportionality, which I think is key in terms of the relevance to the organisation's position, and also an alignment to culture. And I think there's an element of corporate culture, risk culture, board culture, pay culture that needs to be taken into consideration, particularly in looking at where you are currently and where you need to be moving forward on, and just establishing whether there are any sort of gaps in that process. The first slide that's on the page is drawn from one of our RemCo training sessions, and just picking up on some of the considerations when you're looking at a policy review. I think the thing here is that ESG is now one of the key constituents on the radar. But I think the question is ESG just another term for climate change? I was involved in a conversation and presentation with the FCA during the course of this week, and they were talking about the reporting requirements that are now very relevant to listed companies. But what they were talking about was very much the E side of things, and didn't seem to be picking up on the S and the G element. So it's very much a climate change focus of attention. So what does that ESG box sort of cover? I think it could also be picked up in strategy. It could also be picked up in terms of the people side. It could also be picked up in terms of the complexity as well, because I think it's seen as a complex area. I think the question is, what does that ESG box actually mean for you and your business? So it's really trying to be specific in terms of how you look at that area. And I think the other confusing thing through this process is also the balance between the metrics that you're looking at. I saw a figure the other day that ESG now covers 40% of all incentive plan performance measures, especially the environmental sustainability aspects and people, HR, and diversity and inclusion. But it's really how much we focus attention on that area, balanced with all the other key aspects as set out on the slide. If we could look at the next slide, I think it's picking up on the disclosure trends that are coming through. And I think, again, do we look at ESG as a bucket for sort of all areas? And it's really, how do we then balance that with the other disclosures that we need to make in terms of people, in terms of climate in particular. And I think also the disclosure elements really emphasizes the range of different locations within the company report and accounts of this information. So there's elements in the strategic report, elements in the director's report, thinking about also what the remuneration report needs to promote and to emphasize as well. And it's making sure, I think, the linkage to strategy, to risk, and understanding your business model and explaining some of these elements in terms of some of the threats and opportunities in particular, and how these areas are being managed. I think the TCFD, the focus on climate as well, is really trying to balance some of those areas around the governance, the strategy, the risk, and the metrics. Particularly how you put these elements across in terms of what it actually means for you, and how you can bring some of this information to life as well in terms of what you're saying and what you're actually doing in terms of day-to-day activity. I think just going on to the last slide, looking at some of the investor perspectives, I think these tend to be fairly broad brush and high level statements. But I think it's understanding your story, it's understanding the proportionality and relevance across E, S, and G, and trying to look at the reporting requirements that are now coming through very strongly, but also the behaviours that you need to consider, what's going on the ground, what's going on within the organisation, and how does that play out in terms of the culture of the organisation, how the people are behaving in particular, and how we actually deal with the risks that may be identified, to make sure that we're managing those appropriately. I think from the board perspective also, it's how does the board focus attention on these areas? How does it demonstrate leadership? How does it set the right tone? I think the NEDs in particular may feel a bit exposed in terms of getting a sense of the reality of what's going on day to day. I think to date there's been quite an emphasis on the dialogue. I think we do need to avoid resorting to greenwashing or sort of boilerplate words. And we need to make sure that we are following a call to action to make sure that we've got a prioritised plan that can be followed through to make sure we've got the appropriate response. And that really needs to be driven, I think, from the board and also from the support obviously provided by the Remuneration Committee itself in terms of how all of these elements need to come together in terms of how we develop policy, how do we make sure we're innovative in terms of how we're looking at some of these areas and being up to date in terms of the development of ESG in particular. But I think also linking into what we've said in terms of the title of the session today, how is COVID changing this perspective, and how does that link into some of the areas that we've been looking at in terms of developing best practice and making sure we've got a good understanding of what's required. And that's where I'm really keen to understand these perspectives from Boris and Tia in particular, as we look at some of the practical issues in terms of dealing with some of these areas. So I'll now pass back to Louise, and we'll have a look at some of the questions in a bit more detail.
Louis, thank you. Here we go. Great. I'm back. Thank you very much indeed, Louis, for that insight. And so it'd be great to get Tia and Boris and Louis back on screen so that we can talk about now the questions that you kindly answered and reviewed before joining today. And interestingly, what we've seen in terms of from a data perspective is there's such a varied range, and I think organisations are all at a different stage of their evolution in terms of adopting the ESG concepts. And I think a lot of the time, and what we see for when we're supporting boards and supporting candidates when they're going into board processes and C-suite processes is you have the ESG banner that sits the strategy. There's an awful lot of activity that goes on within an organization that is unseen, perhaps not connected to that. And a lot of the time, the ESG strategy can be a great tool to be able to link the great activity going on within the business and almost join the dots. So thinking about the first question, how prepared is your organization for dealing with the ESG concepts? So about 45% said still at an early stage. 28% looked at ESG is all in our plans and currently regularly reviewed in our board meetings. And then dividing down into the basics in terms of the E, the S and the G. In the G, governance came out at 11%, environmental 10%, and social has the most focus. So Tia, with your multiple board activity, it would be great just to hear your insight on that data.
Sure. I thought, I would try to answer those, that first question with my two hats, and I would say, without saying which one is which, I think it might be kind of quite self-explanatory as I explain a little bit more about, the perspectives. One business I involved with is, I would say, in between being at the early stages and have plans. So, it's more advanced than just thinking about it. We have developed a comprehensive plan, but we are not there yet in terms of pinning down exactly what our actions will be, what our targets will be, and the overall impacts. The other business that I'm involved with on the other end is incredibly advanced. They have conducted an employee survey asking everybody in the company what their expectations are from an ESG perspective, what the priorities would be. They've also contacted their customers. So they've reached out to over 480 clients to ask what their expectations were and also where they were on the journey. And they have developed a strategy, they have announced a strategy. There are 6 key cornerstones to that strategy. They've set targets, and it's a quite comprehensive. So they've gone from climate action. Louis has talked about that being a kind of an area of focus, to diversity and inclusion, to empowering colleagues and communities, supporting and connecting with clients, acting with integrity, and building trust and increasing transparency. So two very different perspectives, but absolute focus on trying to make ESG really a cornerstone of the strategy. So this is not just a ticking boxes type of exercise. In particular, this organization is more advanced. It sees being a leading force in ESG as giving the business a commercial advantage, but also sees it as the ethical thing to do, and also from an employee's perspective, it's very much part of the employee value proposition. So kind of, I thought that giving a bit of a kind of a sense of direct experience of the conversations. Probably I will add also to Louis' point. You were talking about the board involvement. My comment on that as well. Now, in one business, we've set up an ESG committee at board level that sits alongside RemCo and audit. And in the other, we don't have an ESG committee at board level. We have an ESG committee at executive level, but the global head of ESG attends every single board meeting to give an update, attends audit committee, attends risk, and is very much, an all-inclusive process. So kind of, different approaches of the same issue.
Thank you, Tia. Boris, it'd be great to hear from your side.
Thank you. And maybe Louis, to your comment when you said how has this been impacted with COVID, and just reflecting on this 1 second, you could have feared that ESG could have been delegated to a second level and lose a bit of a priority, but I think it's fair to say that it has been exasperated and become more and more of a focus. And when I look at the stats and the 45% still at the early stages, I think to me it's a bit of a plea that this will not go away. It's actually mainstream. It is mainstream to the remuneration discussion. It is also mainstream to the broader discussion, and maybe also offer an opportunity to normalize the way we look at organizations. If we look and we introduce ourselves and we reflect on the type of roles and organization we work for, it's quite difficult when you have an external eyes to really understand what they deliver. They deliver to citizens, to consumers. We understand there are public sector organizations, there are commercial organizations, there are non-for-profit organizations, and I think the impact of COVID is seeing the rise of corporate purpose-led organization. And to me, that opportunity goes beyond the remuneration discussion, and for us at Digital has become a main board agenda. Just wanted to share that perspective in terms of the 45% in the early stages. There is something in it, and from there we derive benefits, obviously. In terms of the most impact, probably would vary from industry to industry, would vary from company size. For us, is definitely the social impact that matters. It matters because we are a very heavy people business, and it matters in the talent attraction, it matters in talent retention. It also matters because people increasingly care about the outcome of their work. So in function of product management, people are passionate about what their product deliver. So that aspect is extremely important. The environmental aspect for Digital, irrelevant of remuneration. The company achieved carbon neutral 2 years ago. They want to be net zero by 2030. That's nothing to do with the incentive that the leadership was given. It's simply for them driving what they believe is right. So I would say, for me, it's definitely a main board agenda. It's definitely far-ranging beyond the remuneration, the culture, and maybe when we will talk about how to implement it, we could be able to segment what is expected to be DNA of the company and what needs to be packaged within the remuneration policy.
Boris, thank you very much. That's great. Louis, just looking at your reflections and obviously the organisations that you work with on a day-in, day-out basis, you must have seen an evolution of that in terms of the different client base you've supported and also through the association as well.
Yes, I think I'd echo the comments that Tia and Boris have made actually in terms of that sort of practical application. And I thought it was interesting with Tia's view in terms of the board committee versus executive committee. We've been asking that question through some of the training and interaction that we've had around this area in particular. I think we had some concerns initially that this would be sort of taken off the mainstream and not be picked up in terms of the strategy and the risk elements that really need to, it needs to dovetail into, rather than being seen as something completely sort of separate to all these other areas. Because I think a lot of this is mainstream activity, but it's giving a different focus of attention in areas that probably haven't got that focus previously. And I think interesting that Boris was saying in terms of the social side as well. I was quite surprised in the stats that the social side was a bit lower, because I think, as Boris said, with the pandemic in particular, I think there's been a lot of attention from boards focusing on their people very quickly in terms of supporting their people, making sure the communication lines were clear, helping people to make sure they can, work from home and work in other locations. So I think, we are seeing ESG as a banner, and it's really, what does it mean for you as an organisation? As I said earlier on, how do you break it into the key constituents? And I think, as Tia said, the E side is, is something that you probably need to rethink and to establish what it actually means for you to be environmentally friendly and really understand, what that means to you, particularly as that's really driven by the reporting side that we're seeing as well, in terms of how do we get the data, how do we get the information, how do we make sure that we understand what we're putting across, and drive those actions in particular. We do some work with the Chapter Zero organisation that do a lot of work for boards and NEDs in particular, and their mantra is show us the plan, show us your plan of action. What are you going to do? What's the prioritisation of that plan in particular?
Louise, can I comment on a couple of things? I think, Louis, I really agree with your earlier statement about when people talk about ESG, that's another term for climate change. I wrote it down because I think that's how people are looking at it. And that's why probably the answer in the question, that 5% in social, is because the people are just seeing climate. They're just seeing waste reduction, they're seeing recycling, they're seeing CO2 emissions, they're seeing scope 1, 2, 3, and all of that ahead of everything else. It doesn't mean that leaders are not focusing on the S and the G. They are, but there is this huge pressure to link into RemCo to set targets. And yes, can you set a metric around what you do for the community and get paid a bonus for that? Can't really, it's a bit difficult to do that, or is it appropriate to do that? So there is a whole link to how can we broaden the conversation to make sure that we forget about, or we give less priority and focus to the social side and the governance side, while still doing the right thing from a planet perspective. One of the things I would like to see is a real balance when it comes to talking about RemCo and metrics, in a real balanced approach to how much do we encourage people to drive that, those metrics that impact positively, climate, and how much is on the diversity, inclusion, community engagement, and how much is on governance. And I think there is quite a lot of work that we need to do to achieve that balance. Or if I can comment also on the point we talked about a little bit about boards. We had a very interesting discussion last week with one of the boards about a board level, where is it most appropriate to talk about ESG? Is it the board? Is it the risk committee? Is it the audit committee? Because a lot of this is financial disclosure. It's about reporting. It's about numbers. It's about risk and all of that. And so we were having a conversation within the risk committee, and it was appropriate to do that because we were talking about disclosure and risk management and all of that. But we came out of the conversation, everybody agreeing that this is the responsibility sits at the main board level. It's not just purely risk is one side of it, and we need to make sure that there is always an update on what we're doing and the strategy, the plans, the execution that I know Boris is focused on. It's not just about strategy, but what we do about it, that the discussion takes place at board level.
Tia, thank you for that. And I'd like to ask a question, Boris, just around Digital and your board, that obviously when you're in a smaller organisation with a smaller board, discussion is interwoven, so there is less formality perhaps. And how does that manifest itself from a Digital perspective?
The product leadership, in fact, because when you talk the S, the E, the S and the G, take the S and the G in our industry, technology, they are very closely related. There are regulation, there are governance on how you use the technology, and there are also what you believe is using the technology for good. So that is a proxy for those discussions. When you look at the product, the services you deliver, the industry you choose to serve or not to serve is also a strong statement with regards to how you position your organization in the general context of ESG. And for us, we channel that through the product leadership, and the product leadership is updating the board on a monthly basis.
Great, thank you. So I think moving on to the next question, and Louis touched on it a little around his narrative a couple of minutes ago, but just looking at how prepared is your organisation with all of the environmental and sustainability reporting and disclosure requirements? So again, probably not unsurprising, but 50% was work in progress. We need to, I think a lot of organizations need to sort of understand what do they need to do. So there's a question there about what is it? And then 18% is still at a relatively low level. And then 15% are prepared on an annual basis. So there's quite a mixed bag of data there. And Tia, could I start with you, please?
Yeah, I think my answer is going to be very short on this one. You know, it's work in progress all around. You know, where we are trying to figure out what all of this kind of reporting and disclosure, we're figuring that out very quickly, because we need to disclose by July this year for us. And I think there's a whole industry in itself that is kind of coming to life suddenly about experts on this, and what you need to do and how and what, and the verification of you know, the data that you put out there. So for all of my boards, you know, we are seriously thinking about what we need to do and how we report, what we disclose. From a RemCo perspective, you know, some of the proxy agencies and some of the investors have come out saying, you know, you've got to disclose upfront, ex ante. So none of this is you know, commercially sensitive. You know, you need to disclose targets, you know, upfront. So this is a very much, you know, there's a lot of thinking there and preparation that is happening at the moment. So those who are very good, prepared all around, gosh, you know, I want to hear from you.
Lovely, thanks, Tia. Boris.
Same here. We can open the floor to those people who are advanced, because it's very much work in progress, and maybe sharing what do we mean by well prepared and what is the lens we apply to that question. I think in everything that touches governance / compliance, we could say we're in good shape, because that's kind of table stake mandatory, and it's not that much of an incentive. It's probably more of a penalty falling on the organization if you don't comply. Then trying to drive the discussion a bit more towards operational excellence. You may see the link when I talk about product. I think ESG is a very good proxy for operational excellence. And then going to the next level, which is probably sustainability and value creation, or sustainable value. And looking at those three lenses, how prepared are we? We try to do the right things, bringing that to the DNA of the organization, to bring that to a service we provide to our customers. And then there's a huge amount of work, especially as a listed organization, with regards to being able to report clearly in an auditable way, in a consistent way. And I think the reason we probably see organization more advanced on the E side of things is you already have some framework of some sort which normalize that reporting. The rest is a little bit up in the air. So a lot of work to bring that to life.
Thank you, Boris. And Louis, if I may, focusing quite specifically just on TCFD, and as Tia highlighted, you know, it is almost an industry in itself in terms of organizations getting prepared, particularly within the private equity sector, private equity invested organizations. It'd be great to hear your insight, I think, specifically around the momentum that is building in the market on that side.
Yes, I think it's been driven to some degree by the regulator. I think if you're a listed company, particularly with the FCA requirements now, that you've got to really have a look at the TCFD standards that you need to apply. So I think the question is, what are the expectations? And I think they're high in terms of the regulator perspective. I think it's understanding your stakeholders as well, your stakeholder groups, and what their interest is in this area, and how do you make sure that you put across the right information. And I think also coming back to an element we haven't touched upon, there's been a lot of focus over the last few years on your duties as a director in terms of the success of the company, and you know, Section 172 requirements that are now being reported in the strategic report for a number of organisations. How do we make sure again that this ties into your duties to really demonstrate that you're pulling all this information together, because that's going to have some degree of input into the success of the organisation. I think also, going back to the sort of original point, there have been so many different benchmarks, guidance, areas, different organisations looking at this, that it's been a bit difficult to see the wood for the trees, and everybody's been vying for, you know, use my standards, use my approach. I think the TCFD seems to be gaining the most sort of momentum in terms of reporting requirements. So I think that consistency is a key theme in terms of, you know, what are the common metrics that we need to use so that we can actually do some good comparison and an understanding of how different organisations are coping with this area. So I think you do need to really step back and cover this review by the board in terms of how we're going to approach this, and how do we make sure that the data that we're collecting is the appropriate data. And also, I think the word assurance was used. Who's going to check this data? Who's going to make sure that we've got some degree of assurance around what's being presented? And that really hasn't sort of been picked up so far. I think the auditors looking at financial statements, etc., will be picking this up, but other people within the organisation will need to also give some of that feedback in terms of how consistent and accurate this information that we're collecting is actually falling out in terms of the actual reporting process.
Thank you. Tia, you perhaps had a comment on that?
Yeah, just a couple of things. So I think that what I have seen, the IFRS Foundation is trying to bring all of these standards together and create a common language. Because right now, as Louis says, there is this proliferation of different standards, different metrics, different approaches. It's actually quite difficult to navigate. So having some consistency would certainly be very, very helpful. And the point on verification, that's something which kind of worries me, because to my earlier point about there is going to be an industry set up just to do that, verify those numbers, whether it is the Big Four or others, they will surface, but you will need to rely on an independent third party that actually says that, yeah, you said you were going to do X and you have done X, and it makes sense year after year. So it's quite complex. I think that it's a moving landscape.
Thank you. So before we just move on to the last question, actually really getting to the nub of the discussion, I thought it'd be interesting to share the insight that we've seen from the board practice perspective in terms of hiring recently, and the impacts of and the questioning that occurs from within the boardroom, whether it's listed and fund-led interviews. And certainly the feedback that we've seen and the expectation from a candidate pool is that the understanding of your current organisation's ESG strategy, the execution of it, is a key part of that interview process. And also, how have you delivered and executed it, reported on it, as much as Tia and Boris have talked about the challenges around reporting and accuracy, but also how has that affected the employee pool from a compensation perspective, and have you had challenges? So what we're seeing at the moment, the boardroom is looking for insight from the candidate pool, and vice versa always, but it is interesting to see the questioning that has evolved over the last 18 months to 2 years, where, when I was discussing with candidates in a process, it was relatively uncommon to have ESG as a key thread. Now it is unusual not to discuss it, and it's unusual not to discuss the remuneration policy as well. So I think that brings us nicely on to the last question. Has your remuneration committee started looking at ESG matters as part of its works programme and remuneration policy development? So interestingly, 30% were not sure of their position, 37% were still considering, and 26% had started the process. There was a 7% were well advanced. I'm here, so we'd be great to hear from any of the 7% out there in the audience. But Tia, could I start with you, please?
Yes, for sure. So again, two examples for me, direct experience. In one example where our strategy is coming together and coming to life, and where there has been historically a single focus on profits. The conversation is being quite tough in terms of trying to move on from a unilateral dimension into a more complex and inclusive and balanced perspective. Where we have, on my other board, where we have published our strategy, published our targets, and made the ESG strategy really the core of the business strategy, we are in a very different place. So there we have announced our, we call them KPIs in terms of climate, in terms of gender, in terms of ethnicity. We have publicly disclosed them already, and we have also said publicly that those objectives will be included in the performance requirements of the executive directors of the PLC board. In this specific instance, we have already had diversity targets as part of the balanced scorecard for the last 2 years in the annual bonus. So we have already had gender and race targets that were a third of the personal objectives. So 20% of the bonus opportunity was already based on specific, as I say, gender and ethnicity targets. Now we are looking, and also for the first time this year, we already had, as part of the scorecard, a broader ESG target for the Chief Executive Officer. Now we are at a stage where we're looking at targets for next year, and since we have amended the new targets and aspirations, those will inform the metrics that we will include in the bonus. One thing which we haven't yet got to a decision yet is what are we going to do in terms of the LTIP. And so, some of these targets are, by 2030, by 2025. So it really makes sense being long-term targets that they get measured as part of the LTIP, where we only have financial metrics right now. So that's a conversation that we are going to have. And I suspect that in this particular case, we will include a component of that, whatever the percentage, but might be a small percentage. What we are seeing in the market is a 10 to 20% of the maximum bonus opportunity or LTIP opportunity being linked to ESG targets. So I think that's the direction we will probably go in when the time comes to make that decision.
Great, thank you, Tia. Boris.
That's when the rubber hits the road, as I think you say, in terms of getting these things implemented. And maybe one observation from I think what was said before, in terms of being able to be specific and the value of the intangible. I was reading an article from one of the top consulting firms linking the evolution of values of organization. 2-3 decades ago, the vast majority was from the tangible asset, becoming more from the intangible asset. And I think in our discussion, there's something here, because we try to rationalize, obviously, when we talk remuneration, very objective criteria, everything needs to be clearly established, auditable, and so on. But most of the value of an organization sometimes is intangible. And I think that's where, for me, when we look at the remuneration discussion, the first question is what really falls into the remuneration policies and what is part and parcel of the broader organization. There are many policies within the HR department which plays towards having the right social inclusion, having the right flexibility for the employees. Those will never be strictly connected to the remuneration, but they are an integral part of achieving the outcome. So I think it becomes extremely specific when we try to talk about the implementation based on your sector, the size of your organization, what really matters. Maybe I'm a dash too pragmatic on that one, but I would say at the end of the day, these are objectives. So if they are important, we should be able to find them. And I don't think, especially for the company I'm working with, and the size of Digital, we don't ambition to cover the entire spectrum. We just ambition to pick up the one which are the most impactful, and yes, follow the guidance, follow the good work to implement those as part of the executive remuneration. So we are, I think, clear on our position, but we are really work in progress in making that explicit and fully disclosable.
Thank you, Boris. Louis, it'd be great to hear from you. And then we've had some fantastic questions from the audience. So keen to touch on a couple of those before we close at 2 o'clock.
Yes, I think the Remuneration Committee is looking at the position in terms of where are we now and where do we need to be, and looking at how to bridge that gap and make sure that they are picking up on some of the changes that are coming through. And also, I think there's been a push more to look outside of pure sort of executive remuneration as well, in terms of what's going on within the organisation generally, in terms of being consistent, in terms of looking at differentials in terms of gender and other aspects. So that's been coming through sort of very strongly. I think it's very much also looking at the ability to pull this information together and to break it down into those aspects that you're able to look at performance, you're able to measure against the targets that can be set. And I think Tia said in one of her first comments about where things have been successful, it has been tied into strategic development, in terms of if you're well down the track in terms of KPIs and measurement of achieving the strategy, and you can build some of this element into that view, then I think it gives you a real foundation to work from. I think also people have been looking at it from a risk-based view in terms of where are our risks across the organisation, and I think people have been very much to the forefront, picking up on some of the comments Boris made in terms of that sort of social aspect. And I think that is also linked into the lessons learned from the pandemic as well, because I think we've gone through quite a bit of change through the process, and I think a lot of that has been focused, as we said earlier on, in terms of the social side as much as anything else. So how can we make sure that the organisation is fit for purpose moving forward? And that is again going to resonate in terms of diversity and inclusion, and making sure that we've got the right constituents that are coming together in terms of the strategy of the organisation. But I very much agree with Boris's view in terms of this tangible versus intangible aspects. And I think the culture of the organisation has come through very strongly. There was a very good document the FRC produced just before Christmas in looking at culture within the organisation and just doing a bit of a health check of some of the areas that you could have a look at, because I think culture drives all of this forward in terms of the behaviours of your people across each of those areas that I talked about earlier on, in terms of your corporate culture, your risk culture, the board culture. So the people at the top doing the right things should then permeate down through the organisation as well. So I think all these elements are coming together strongly in terms of the Remuneration Committee. And I think that the other thing with the committees, how much interaction is there between the committees as well? And I think Tia mentioned, the Risk Committee, Audit Committee elements, and looking at some of the performance areas. So is there good interaction between the Remuneration Committee, the Nomination Committee, in terms of how we're bringing the best people through to sit on at board level or take executive positions in particular? But I think that communication and an understanding of the dialogue at that level is important as well. So we make sure we're focused on the right things.
Thank you, Louis. One question from the participants is, does the panel have any examples of companies who are making tangible progress on the climate change issues? And that's probably excluding renewable energy companies. But Tia, have you got any insight on that?
Oh, really? Sorry, I can't help on that. I was just trying to think. I think, most companies have, as we've seen, are on on a journey on this, and they are at the beginning of the journey, and looking at their targets. You know, there are some examples and summaries of targets that companies have published. There is a whole variety of different, you know, everybody wants to be carbon net zero, you know, by you know, the kind of different stages. Some companies say 2030, some, I'm just looking at, you know, kind of a report I got in front of me, 2040. You know, it's early stages. You know, I primarily operate in the retail and you know, kind of hospitality, leisure, environment, and professional services. And you know, the only thing I would say there, you know, just to kind of a link into what Louis and Boris have been saying about culture, is in these areas where you rely on suppliers, or you rely on you know, people changing behavior, is really winning hearts and minds of everybody in the organization to make sure that some of these targets are going to be achieved. You know, there are examples of companies that have set targets that are more kind of, you know, recycling, which are probably easier in a way to achieve, or, you know, waste reduction, recycling, and there are, you know, good examples there, like, you know, Dixon's or Barrett's or you know, others. But in terms of kind of, you know, emissions and all of that, I think that everybody's on a journey.
Okay. Thank you, Tia. Boris, any insight perhaps? I'm conscious we've got aligned sectors on the call today, but any insight from you on that question?
I'm afraid no. Not on this one.
Okay, thank you. I think going on to the last question, just looking at timelines, and thank you very much for the audience out there for providing some great questions today. Really, it's great to have your interaction, even if we can't directly see your faces. Tia, you touched on this in your narrative earlier, just around how are you measuring ethnicity in your organization, and how can you, is there any advice you can give about how to continue doing this? There would be an argument to say it should be now a given from a diversity perspective, but I don't think, I think there's always going to have to be reporting on it. It'd be great to get your insight.
So look, on the broader topic of diversity and inclusion targets, we are seeing a whole variety of different approaches. You know, I've got here a few in front of me. Some talk about gender, some talk about ethnicity, some go specifically, like for example, Sainsbury's is specifically talking about, you know, Black colleagues and Black colleagues representation at, you know, senior level. Or Black heritage, you know, colleagues, and they've set a specific, you know, target in the case of Sainsbury's. You know, how do you go about? I mean, collecting data is a big issue in terms of ethnicities. We all know encouraging disclosure and encouraging people to share is something everybody is grappling with varying degrees of success. You know, I think everybody's getting better at that. It would be great if at some point we could have the government getting off the fence, having done the consultation on ethnicity pay gap reporting. If they, you know, in between parties, they could come up with that, you know, okay, we're going to do this now, and give some guidance and a strong message of this is important. But, you know, we've seen a few companies already disclosing on a voluntary basis their ethnicity pay gap reporting. You know, I can think about two companies, certainly in the hospitality sector, they have done that at the same time as publishing gender pay gap. You know, there is a huge focus on ethnicity. I mean, as we know, the FTSE 100 have missed their targets of having one member of the board from an ethnic minority perspective. FTSE 250, they've got to reach their target by 2024. You know, there is so much that, you know, we need to do cross-industry to ensure that we prioritize ethnic representation and you know, kind of more broadly inclusion as a whole across the industry. It's really something I'm absolutely passionate about, and can be quite, sound like a broken record on my voice in terms of making sure that we take this seriously and we make a difference.
Thank you, Tia. Boris.
I agree. As you said, targets should not exist. And unfortunately, they help to measure progress. So if we focus on the progress, I would like maybe to link my answer to a couple of other questions I've seen in terms of do executives need targets? And I think they do help to shape and to guide and to measure progress, but clearly leaders don't need those targets. And most of the discussion we had today demonstrate that the ones who are doing a great job are much more proactive than the need for targets. And again, that in my view also answer what is our observation with regards to organization who struggle to fit ESG target versus traditional earnings target. There are means to that outcome. There are means to performance. And I think we are in the zone of operational excellence when we talk about ESG, moving away from compliance and governance, being forced to do it. And I really hope that we will very quickly move into sustainable value creation. That's the way I look at that journey with regards to ESG and how it impacts people and organization.
Thank you, Boris. And finally, Louis, any comments?
I think it is a journey that we're taking here. I think it's really how can we affect a change and kickstart some of this. I think obviously reporting information is key to that, but I think you need somebody in the organization who's going to drive this forward, and I think you need HR teams in particular, working together in terms of how can we make sure that we affect some degree of change in terms of appointments at all levels across the organization. I think we're struggling at board level at the moment to make sure that we're affecting change, and then if people don't see it at board level, they think that boards aren't taking it seriously. But I think it's such a difficult topic, and I think it does take time, as we found with gender representation has taken a lot of time. So I think it's really coming up with some clear actions that can actually make a difference, and they're supported across the organisation.
Thank you. Look, thank you very much for all your comments and insight this afternoon. It's been an absolute pleasure having this discussion, and I think I've got three sort of points that I've taken away, and one actually popped up right at the very beginning around what does ESG mean for you as an individual and an organisation, and secondly, Boris, you mentioned this a couple of times in your narrative around it's a proxy for organisational excellence, and I think that sums it up really well in terms of that leadership from the board perspective. How do we lead by example and deliver excellence across organisations? And then finally, as board members, it is our directors' duty, as of section 172, in order to deliver this to the best of our ability. So it is ingrained in all of us as directors in a boardroom to be able to deliver a comprehensive ESG strategy and support the organisation across all elements of it. So thank you very much. Thank you very much to our audience for joining us this afternoon. The next Non-Executive Directors Association and Eton Bridge Partners webinar will be in July. And we will be focusing on inclusion. Be lovely if you can join us then. But I'll say goodbye now and have a good rest of your week. Thank you very much.
Thank you.